The night shift at Mercy General in Norfolk moved at its own rhythm, slower than day shift, deeper, the way hospitals breathe when the sun isn't looking. Sarah Chen moved through the corridors at 2,300 hours with surgical precision that nobody noticed because nobody was watching. Her scrubs were faded to the color of old concrete, her sneakers worn through at the heel, her badge clipped to a lanyard that had seen better years. She checked vitals in room 301, BP stable, heart rate steady, O2 sat holding at 94%, and made a note in the chart with a pen that clicked exactly once. The ventilator in room 305 wheezed its mechanical rhythm like a sleeping giant. She adjusted the flow, read the settings without having to think about it, the way some people read their own reflection. Her hands moved through the work with the kind of muscle memory that doesn't come from nursing school textbooks. These hands had performed emergency thoracotomies under mortar fire in Marjah 3 years ago, had cracked open chests in field hospitals where the only light was a headlamp duct taped to a bed frame, had held organ still while round snapped past close enough to burn. But that Sarah Chen didn't officially exist anymore. The Senior Chief Petty Officer designation, the call sign that whispered through Special Forces ready rooms from Kandahar to Ramadi, all of it had been buried under classified protocols and redacted files. Now she was just a night shift nurse with steady hands and a limp nobody mentioned. The limp favored her left leg, a souvenir from a roadside explosive 3 weeks before the end of her last deployment. She'd disguised it by walking slower than necessary, a deliberate pace that made people think she was being methodical rather than wounded. The injury had healed wrong on purpose, she'd refused surgery, let the scar tissue tighten across her tibialis anterior the way it wanted to, because a perfectly recovered leg would raise questions. A limp was a story that ended. A full recovery would be a story that continued. She didn't want continuations. At 2,147 hours, she opened her locker in the break room and looked at the black trash bag wedged behind her spare scrubs. Inside were combat boots, size 6, military issue, the leather scarred with burn marks and stains that no amount of scrubbing had ever fully removed. They weighed almost nothing now, hollowed out by time and use. She'd carried them through 3 continents and now carried them to work like some people carried photographs of dead relatives. She touched the trash bag once, the way you'd touch a memorial stone, then closed the locker door. The sound echoed in the empty break room like a statement being closed. Room for 47 held General Marcus Wade of Special Forces, 62 years old, recovering from a massive stroke that had left him 3 weeks behind everyone else. The medications, the anticoagulants, the anti-seizure cocktail, the blood pressure regulators, had built a fog between him and the world that was supposed to be temporary but was showing no signs of lifting. His memory for current events had vanished like someone had scooped it out. He could remember his first deployment, his ex-wife's name, the tactical doctrine he'd written himself in 1997. But he couldn't remember the nurse who'd adjusted his for in the morning. He couldn't remember yesterday. Sarah moved into the room with the same precise efficiency she brought to every task. The monitors cast a blue glow across his sleeping face. His left forearm rested on top of the blanket, and there, in blocky military lettering, was the name Chen. She'd seen it the first time she'd changed his for, 3 days after she started the shift rotation. Her chest had done something uncomfortable, a tightening that felt like grief, but she'd kept her face neutral and adjusted the medication drip to the prescribed rate. He'd opened his eyes and looked at her with the polite confusion of a stranger, and she'd smoothed his blanket and said nothing. "Vital stable," she said aloud, though he was sleeping. It was a habit, narrating the medical reality, speaking it into existence. Blood pressure 120/74. Heart rate 68, regular as a metronome. O2 saturation 96%. "You're doing fine, sir." The words were for her, not for him. She was leaving the room when the footsteps started in the corridor. Rapid footsteps. The kind that meant someone important was coming. Dr. Raymond Hargrove arrived for morning rounds 20 minutes early, the way ambitious men did, trying to catch the night shift in some small failing they could note and later mention to the board. His white coat was crisp enough to stand on its own, his jawline sharp as a geometry problem, his presence the kind that made the fluorescent light seem to hum differently. He was new to Chief of Medicine, 3 months in, and he'd spent those 3 months reshaping the hospital's hierarchy like a man rearranging furniture to make sure everyone knew where the power was. He saw Sarah in the hallway outside room for 47 and something flickered across his face. Recognition, maybe, of the fact that she'd been competent during rounds. That she'd caught a medication error he'd almost made 2 days ago and corrected it so quietly that nobody but him knew it had happened. He'd watched her hands move through the for adjustment, steady hands, hands that didn't shake, hands that clearly knew what they were doing. And he'd felt the small, poisonous surge of threat that ambitious men feel when they encounter competence that doesn't require their permission to exist. "Nurse Chen," he said, and the way he said it suggested her name was something unsanitary he'd discovered on the bottom of his shoe. "The general is sleeping again." "He sleeps about 16 hours a day," Sarah said. Her voice was soft, deferential. "The stroke destroyed his sleep-wake cycle. The neurology team is monitoring." "I see." Hargrove moved closer, and Sarah watched his eyes move over General Wade's chart with the kind of scan that took information without understanding it. "And has he regained any cognitive function? Any memory recovery?" "No, sir. No change in the past 2 weeks." "Unfortunate." Hargrove made a note, a physical notation, pen to paper, the sound of it like a gavel coming down. "He'll likely never improve substantially. I'll be recommending we move him to a long-term facility by the end of the month. No sense wasting acute care beds on patients who won't recover." Sarah didn't respond. She knew the statistics. She knew that patients 3 weeks post-stroke with his type of bleed had a recovery window that was shrinking. She also knew that General Wade had been her commanding officer, that he'd once ordered a helicopter insertion into a kill zone to extract her after an IED detonation, that his name was tattooed on her arm the same way hers was on his. But that General Wade was a classified memory now. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen had been dissolved, buried under paperwork and redacted operational summaries. The person standing in this corridor was just a nurse with decent assessment skills and a convenient limp. "I'll continue monitoring his vitals," she said. Hargrove turned to leave, then paused. He looked at her the way a general looks at a troop who's just volunteered for something dangerous. There was calculation in it. "Threat assessment. Have you been a nurse long, Nurse Chen?" 8 years, sir." "And before that?" "Healthcare administration. Hospital work, mostly." The lie came out smooth. She'd rehearsed it the way soldiers rehearse cover stories. When you couldn't tell the truth, you told something close enough to the truth that it felt inevitable. "Interesting." Hargrove's smile wasn't a smile. It was a baring of teeth, the way that apex predators smile when they've found something to hunt. "You have excellent clinical instincts. Very sharp. Very aware." He paused, letting the compliment sit there like bait. "We'll have to find better use for someone with your skills. More responsibility, perhaps. More visibility during rounds." Sarah recognized the trap. More visibility meant more scrutiny. More responsibility meant more opportunities to fail in front of important people. More opportunities for someone like Hargrove to have a reason to dig into her background, to ask questions about that 8 years she'd mentioned, to start pulling at the loose threads of a cover story she'd spent 3 years constructing. "I'm content with my current assignment, sir. Night shift, stable patients. I like the quiet." "I'm sure you do." Hargrove walked away then, and Sarah stood in the hallway listening to his footsteps recede down the corridor, knowing that somewhere in his mind, he'd marked her as something that needed handling. Men like Hargrove always did that. They saw competence without deference and heard it as an argument. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she was right. In Hargrove's office on the 4th floor, he was already reaching for his phone, already making a calculation about which board member owed him a favor large enough to justify a discreet personnel inquiry. He'd already decided that a nurse with combat-grade field medicine instincts and a manufactured cover story about healthcare administration was the kind of loose end that needed tidying before she caused problems. He knew people. He knew how to make calls. He knew how to dig. And somewhere in room for 47, General Marcus Wade slept on, his short-term memory still fractured, his long-term memory intact enough to hold a name he couldn't access. 47 lives. That's what Sarah had saved in Marjah during the 48 hours that General Wade could still remember her face. That's what the classified report said, back when classified reports existed to say anything at all about Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen. But those lives were history now. Buried. And the boots in her locker were waiting. The morning rounds began the way they always did at Mercy General, fluorescent lights humming their mechanical monotone, the ventilator in room for 41 wheezing its rhythmic exhale, nurses moving between stations with the practiced efficiency of people who'd learned to function on 6 hours of sleep and coffee that tasted like burnt rubber. Sarah had been on night shift for 18 years. She knew the rhythm of this place the way musicians know their instruments. She could read a monitor's story before the attending physician finished buttoning his coat. Mr. Peterson was in room for 45, post-operative day 3, recovering from aortic valve replacement. Sarah had watched his overnight vitals track across her screen from midnight until the shift change. His heart rate dropped to 42 at 3 in the morning. Dropped again to 40 at 4:15. The pattern was there if you looked, not dramatic enough for an alarm, but telling enough if you understood what it meant. A beta-blocker protocol that was too aggressive. A medication dosage that needed adjustment before it became something worse. Dr. Hargrove arrived for morning rounds at 7:48 a.m. wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than Sarah's monthly car payment. He moved through the cardiac wing like a general inspecting territory he owned, 3 residents trailing behind him with charts clutched like shields. His presence did something to the air, made it thinner, made it harder to breathe. He had that particular talent of men who'd built their careers on the backs of people too intimidated to speak. When they reached Peterson's room, Sarah was already there, having just finished her notes. She stepped forward as Hargrove began his assessment, and she waited for the right moment, the moment when he asked if there were any overnight concerns. She didn't wait long. Hargrove glanced at her with the expression people reserve for inconvenient furniture. "Anything remarkable, nurse?" Mr. Peterson's heart rate dropped to 42 at 3 o'clock, doctor. And again at 4:15. His current beta-blocker protocol might be aggressive. His overnight perfusion looks marginal. I'd suggest reducing the metoprolol from 50 milligrams to 37, and... Hargrove stopped mid-sentence. He turned to the residents beside him, Dr. Nakamura, Dr. Yates, and a third year named Morris who was still young enough to be impressed by institutional authority. Hargrove smiled. It wasn't a kind expression. "Gentlemen, this is precisely why we don't let the help practice medicine. Stick to bedpans, sweetheart." He turned back to Peterson's monitor without waiting for a response. The patient is within normal parameters. Bradycardia is not uncommon postoperatively. Continue current protocol. The residents laughed nervously. The kind of laughter that happens when people recognize a power structure and decide they'd rather be on the side doing the laughing. Sarah felt heat crawl up her neck like fingers. She took one measured breath, the kind she'd learned in Marjah, the kind that kept your hand steady when your mind wanted to rage, and said in a voice like winter steel, the patient's heart rate dropped to 42 at 0300, doctor. Hargrove waved his hand dismissively, already moving toward the next room. The gesture said more than words. It said, "I have heard you. I have assessed you. You are nothing." She didn't follow them. She stayed with Mr. Peterson, checked his 4, and said nothing else. But 2 days later, Hargrove's calculation had evolved. Social mockery wasn't enough. He needed witnesses. He needed the story to spread. He needed everyone in this hospital to understand that challenging him had a cost. The cafeteria at Mercy General occupied the hospital's south wing, a space designed by someone who believed that fluorescent lighting and the smell of industrial-grade cleaning solution would somehow make people feel nourished. It was packed during lunch hour, nurses from every department, residents comparing notes, attending physicians claiming the best tables like territorial predators. Sarah had learned to eat quickly and alone, using the 30 minutes to decompress before returning to the cardiac wing. She'd just pulled her tray from the rack when she saw Hargrove at the doctor's table, holding court with Dr. Morris, Dr. Sullivan, and Dr. Yates, the same residents who'd laughed during rounds. She carried her tray carefully. The soup was hot. The salad was balanced. She was moving past their table when Hargrove shifted slightly in his chair. His foot extended into her path, not dramatically, just enough. A tiny adjustment. The kind of thing that could have been accidental. Her tray hit the tile floor. Soup splashed across her shoes. The salad scattered like green confetti. A bread roll rolled 3 feet across the cafeteria floor. The entire room went dead silent. Even the industrial dishwasher stopped mid-cycle, as if it had paused to witness something important. Hargrove looked down at her from his seat, his expression a mask of exaggerated concern. "Oh, Nurse Chen. How clumsy. Pick that up, sweetheart. That's more your speed than questioning my protocols." The other doctors laughed. Not the nervous laughter from the patient room. This was the laughter of people who'd been granted permission to enjoy someone else's humiliation. Sarah knelt slowly, her bad leg screaming, the left knee that had taken shrapnel in Sanjan Valley, the injury that had never quite healed right. She began gathering the soggy lettuce, the broken crockery, the soup-soaked napkins. Her hands wanted to shake. They didn't. She'd learned long ago that rage had a sharp edge, and if you weren't careful about how you held it, it would cut you more than it cut anyone else. One tear escaped down her cheek. Just one. The kind of tear that happens when you're not paying attention, when your body betrays your composure for a single second. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Hargrove, rose with the dripping tray, and walked to the trash can. When she turned back, the entire cafeteria was watching. Every nurse. Every resident. Every orderly who'd paused mid-delivery. She met Hargrove's gaze one more time. "I've survived worse mornings before my first cup of coffee." She walked out without eating. She didn't need to see the shock in his face. She didn't need to hear the silence that followed her words. She was already gone, already back in the cardiac wing, already checking vitals, already moving through her shift like the incident had never happened. But it had happened. And Hargrove knew it. He knew that his hammer had met something harder than he expected, and that realization changed something in him. Changed him into something more dangerous. That afternoon, during the 3 p.m. shift change when the nurses' station filled with 18 people, morning shift giving report to evening shift, Hargrove arrived with a whiteboard marker in his hand. He wrote across the main board, his letters large and precise, Chen resignation pool. The date. He looked at the gathered nurses and doctors with the casual certainty of a man who'd never had his will seriously challenged. "I'm making a wager, ladies and gentlemen. I give Nurse Chen 1 week before she quits. This job clearly isn't for her. Any takers?" Dr. Morris offered $5 that she'd be gone by day 3. Dr. Sullivan bet $10 she'd make it 4 days. Dr. Yates smiled and added, "She'll cry in a supply closet by day 2. Sarah was standing 3 feet away, checking medication orders. She didn't look up. But she heard every word. Every single one of them landed with the precision of a calculated strike. They were supposed to. Hargrove was making sure she heard. He was making sure everyone heard. He was painting the narrative, Sarah Chen is fragile. Sarah Chen is breakable. Sarah Chen will quit. He was wrong about a lot of things. But the most dangerous part was that he had no idea he was wrong. He couldn't see what was underneath the scrubs and the careful composure. He couldn't see 18 years of night shifts. He couldn't see Marjah. He couldn't see the weight of lives carried on shoulders that had learned to carry impossible things. He just saw a nurse who'd challenged his authority, and he decided, with the absolute certainty of institutional privilege, exactly how long it would take to break her. The next morning during rounds, Hargrove arrived at the nurse's station and threw Sarah's patient charts across the counter. Papers scattered like leaves across tile. Her shift notes scattered. Her vitals documentation scattered. Her careful handwriting spread across the floor like evidence of incompetence. Your charting is sloppy, your suggestions are out of line, and your presence undermines this hospital's standards. 1 week, sweetheart. Tick-tock. He smiled like he'd just delivered a masterpiece. But that wasn't the worst part. Not even close. That night at 2:17 a.m., Sarah was standing at the nurse's station reviewing room 447's overnight labs when the monitor alarm screamed. Not the soft beeping of a concern. The high-pitched wailing of a crisis. General Wade's room. His monitor showed something collapsing, something acute and catastrophic. His blood pressure was dropping. His O2 sat was falling. His monitors showed fluid where there shouldn't be fluid. His heart was being crushed from the inside. The monitor alarm at 0200 hours didn't scream. It wailed. 3 sharp electronic shrieks that cut through the 4th floor like a blade, and Sarah's head snapped up from the medication cart before the 3rd pulse finished. Room for 47. General Wade. She was moving before the 2nd code announcement crackled over the intercom, her feet knowing the exact 17 steps from the med station to his door, her muscle memory older than her nursing license. The room was already chaos when she arrived. Resident Dr. Patel stood frozen beside the bed, eyes locked on the monitor displaying numbers that spelled catastrophe. Wade's blood pressure had collapsed to 62/38. His heart rate climbed toward 140, a panicked rhythm trying to compensate for something fundamentally broken inside his chest. The 4 lines hung like useless strings. The ventilator hissed its mechanical breath, completely indifferent to the fact that the man it was supposed to help was being crushed from within. Cardiac tamponade, Sarah said. Not a question. She was already moving to Wade's side, fingers finding the space between his ribs at the 5th intercostal space, her touch reading the geography of his chest like a map she'd memorized a lifetime ago. This wasn't nursing protocol. This was something else entirely, hands that had held lives together in mud and darkness, hands that remembered how to do impossible things when seconds mattered more than regulations. Dr. Patel's voice came out strangled. We need to call cardiothoracic. We need to get him to the OR. We need a 14-gauge needle. Now. Sarah's voice had changed. The timid night shift nurse was gone. What remained was someone else entirely, speaking with the flat precision of a person accustomed to command, to being obeyed, to situations where hesitation meant death. She wasn't asking. She was stating facts. The attending physician, Dr. Morrison, had arrived and was reaching for the phone to activate the emergency response team. Sarah didn't look at him. She was already opening the crash cart, hands moving with terrifying fluid precision, muscle memory overriding every thought, every rational objection, every awareness that what she was about to do existed in the space between her official job title and whatever she actually was. Pericardiocentesis. Emergency needle decompression of the pericardial space. The procedure that saved lives when the heart itself became its own death trap, when fluid pressure was collapsing the cardiac chambers. The kind of procedure that got performed in operating rooms by surgeons who'd trained for years, not by night shift nurses with classified military records and a disappearing act that predated everyone in the hospital. Sarah's hands moved. The alcohol swab. The pressure point. The needle, smooth, purposeful, an extension of her own intention. The fluoroscopy unit was already being wheeled in, but she didn't wait for guidance. She didn't need it. Her hands had done this before, in a field hospital in Helmand Province with mortar fire hammering the corrugated metal roof, with a captain bleeding out from a roadside IED, with the kind of pressure that came from knowing failure meant watching someone die. The needle punctured skin. Found muscle. Slipped between the ribs with the precision of a surgical laser. 60 milliliters of blood-tinged fluid hissed free, decompressing the space around his heart, releasing the pressure that was methodically squeezing Wade's cardiopulmonary function into nothing. The monitors responded instantly. O2 sat climbed from 78 to 82. Blood pressure stabilized. Heart rate began its descent from panic toward something approximating normal. The change was dramatic, definitive, impossible to deny. General Wade's heart began beating with purpose again instead of desperation. Dr. Morrison stood completely motionless. His phone was still in his hand, disconnected call glowing on the screen. His jaw was slightly open. The expression on his face was the look of someone who'd just watched a night shift nurse execute an emergency procedure with such technical competence, such bone-deep certainty, that it rewrote every assumption he'd ever made about who she was. "Get him typed and crossed," Sarah said, her voice still that knife-edged command, completely devoid of the careful deference that had characterized every interaction she'd had with physicians for the past 4 years. "He's going to need surgery, but he's stable enough to transport. Call cardiothoracic. Now." No one moved for exactly 3 seconds. Then Dr. Patel grabbed the phone. A nurse rushed toward the supply station. The machinery of crisis response kicked into motion, but everyone in that room understood something had fundamentally shifted. The monitors continued their steady beeping, a sinus rhythm, strong and true, where 3 minutes ago there had been electrical chaos and cardiovascular collapse. Sarah's hands were steady as she disposed of the needle. Not a tremor. Not a single sign of the magnitude of what she'd just done, the risk she'd just taken, the professional violation she'd just committed with such deliberate precision that it couldn't possibly be anything less than calculated and certain. General Wade's eyes flickered open. His pupils dilated, tracking toward the sound of her voice, and for a moment something passed between them, recognition that existed below consciousness, below memory, somewhere in the ancient part of the brain that remembers rescues and understands debt. Then the sedation pulled him back under, and he was gone again, breathing on his own terms now instead of fighting the ventilator, his heart restored to purpose. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't the moment that would unravel everything. That would come in 8 hours, when Dr. Hargrove arrived at his office at 0800 and heard the story from a resident who couldn't contain the narrative of what Sarah had done. When Dr. Hargrove realized that she'd performed an invasive emergency procedure, alone, without physician supervision, saving a patient's life with competence that suggested medical training far beyond what her credentials indicated. That was when he made the phone calls. That was when he activated the network of favors and debts and strategic relationships he'd been building for years. That was when the attack accelerated beyond social humiliation into something colder, more calculated, more dangerous. Because now she wasn't just a threat to his hierarchy. She was liability. She was proof. She was evidence of something she wasn't supposed to be. Sarah finished the paperwork, standard crisis documentation, vital sign logs, medication records, with the same mechanical precision she brought to everything. The fluoroscopy unit was wheeled back out. Cardiothoracic was being contacted for surgical evaluation. General Wade's stabilization would buy him time, would get him to a surgeon before his compromised heart failed again. The standard praise came from the nursing staff, awkward and incomplete. Even Dr. Morrison managed a nod of acknowledgement, though his eyes contained questions he knew better than to ask. By 0600, the morning shift had arrived. Sarah gave them report with the same deference she'd always used, same careful subordination of her own knowledge to the hierarchy of the hospital's medical authority. The performance was flawless. By 0700, she'd logged out and was walking toward the parking lot, and no one in Mercy General except the people who'd been in room for 47 at 0200 had any idea what the night had actually contained. The rain was coming down in sheets, hammering the asphalt like applause that would never stop. Her car was parked in the far corner of the lot, the one she always chose because it was away from cameras, away from witnesses, away from the kind of scrutiny that might someday penetrate the carefully constructed civilian identity she'd been living inside for 4 years. She sat in the driver's seat for exactly 7 minutes, engine off, rain drowning the windows, before she pulled out her personal phone to find 6 missed calls from the hospital administration office and 1 text message scheduled to arrive at 1000 sharp, report to the administrative conference room. Mandatory meeting. She knew what was coming. She'd known the moment her hands moved without permission, the moment she'd stepped outside the boundaries of what just a nurse was allowed to do. In serving General Wade, she'd exposed herself. She'd picked a fight with institutional power, with the careful documentation of her own civilian trail, with the 7-year-old agreement that said if she ever surfaced, if she ever acted like anything other than what her false credentials claimed she was, the consequences would be absolute and irreversible. The rain kept falling. The windshield wipers squeaked against the glass like a metronome counting down the hours until everything changed. The rain kept falling. The windshield wipers squeaked against the glass like a metronome counting down the hours until everything changed. At Mercy General, Dr. Hargrove stood in his office at 02 for 7 hours, the cardiac monitor still echoing in his ears, that impossible procedure performed by a floor nurse who had no business touching a scalpel. His hands trembled as he reached for his desk phone. Not fear. Rage. He'd built his position on exclusion, on keeping competent threats below the hierarchy line where they belonged. Sarah Chen had just exposed herself completely, and he would use that exposure like a blade. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 0600, summoned by Hargrove's authority as chief of medicine. He spent the next 3 hours making calls, strategic, calculated, weaponized. His voice remained steady as he spoke to board member Henderson, who'd hired him. She performed an invasive procedure without attending physician oversight. Criminal negligence. Henderson owed him favors. 2 of them, actually. The second call went to board member Cross, who'd benefited from Hargrove's consulting contracts. I need your vote. The liability exposure is catastrophic. The third call was different, quieter, more deliberate. He dialed an investigator he'd placed at the Virginia Board of Nursing 2 years ago, a woman who'd paid for her daughter's law school with Hargrove's anonymous contributions. Run her credentials, he said. Verify every school, every degree, every certification. I need discrepancies. The investigator called back 90 minutes later. Her voice carried something like excitement mixed with confusion. Her nursing school references won't confirm her attendance records. Norfolk Medical Institute says they have no graduate by that name for the year she claims. And her social security number shows employment gaps. Unexplained federal employment from 2009 to 2019 with redacted employers. She paused. Doctor, there are gaps in her timeline that don't match any civilian timeline. It's like she didn't exist for a decade. Hargrove smiled. A decorated military background she couldn't discuss would look like fraud when examined through the lens of a nursing license. Perfect. Document everything. I'm escalating this to the board. By 0600, the emergency meeting convened in the boardroom, 8 board members, Hargrove at the head of the table, the hospital CEO flanking him like a second. The presentation took 40 minutes. Hargrove displayed the pericardiocentesis procedure on the monitor, frame by frame, his commentary clinical and damning. Notice the confidence. Notice the precision. This is not the work of a floor nurse. This is a trained surgical operator performing a restricted procedure. She bypassed chain of command, violated protocols, and compromised patient safety through unauthorized intervention. The CEO leaned forward. What's your recommendation, Doctor? Immediate suspension pending investigation. We need the state licensing board to review her credentials. Hargrove pressed a button. Documents appeared on screen, the gaps in her timeline, the unverifiable employment history, the institutional records that simply didn't exist. I suspect credential fraud. That procedure she performed? It was only possible because of training she's unable to officially account for. Henderson exchanged a glance with Cross. Both nodded. The vote was unanimous. Suspension effective immediately. Badge deactivated. Full investigation pending. The liability waiver was already being drafted. The hospital would not be held responsible for the actions of an unlicensed practitioner operating beyond her scope. Sarah was pulled from the break room at 0730 by security. No discussion. No interview. No opportunity to explain. The officer, a young man named Torres who'd asked her for first aid advice 3 weeks ago, wouldn't meet her eyes as he deactivated her badge. Hospital policy, he said quietly. You're suspended pending investigation. You'll need to contact legal. She didn't speak. She didn't ask questions. She simply walked to her locker, pulled out her personal items, 2 extra sets of scrubs, a pen, a granola bar she'd forgotten about, and the trash bag containing the combat boots she'd kept hidden in the bottom locker, wrapped in a hospital blanket. The boots were 12 years old, salt-stained from desert sweat, the laces still tied in the knots from the last time she'd worn them in Marjah. They were her only official documentation. No certificate could prove what those boots had witnessed. "I'm sorry," Torres said as she walked past. "I don't know what happened, but I know you saved General Wade's life." Sarah didn't respond. Composure meant silence sometimes. She walked out through the employee exit at 0745, the morning sun harsh on her face, and drove to the VA hospital 12 miles north on Military Highway. The waiting room at Norfolk Veterans Affairs Medical Center held the smell of antiseptic layered over something older, coffee that had been sitting for hours, the accumulated exhaustion of men and women whose bodies kept score of places they'd been. Sarah sat in a plastic chair that had cradled 1,000 broken people, holding the trash bag with her boots against her chest like armor. A Marine with a prosthetic leg sat 3 chairs down, the socket visible where his pant leg had ridden up. His name tag, barely visible on his jacket, read Fallujah 2005. The army sergeant across from her had burn scars, not small ones. Significant ones. 3rd-degree coverage on his left side, his eye slightly hooded from scar tissue. The sailor in the corner had the 1,000-yard stare that meant either PTSD or both, the look of someone who'd been in the water when it got very cold and very dark. She recognized 2 of them. The Marine with the prosthetic was Lance Corporal Derek Mathis. She'd stopped his femoral artery bleed with a tourniquet in Sanjin Valley while rounds punched through the roof of their aid station. The sergeant was Staff Sergeant Mitchell Corey. She'd treated his burns in a forward surgical team when IED shrapnel had ignited his fuel bladder. They'd called her Nightingale 6 over the radio net when the Medivac bird came in. They'd written her name on their uniforms in marker when they thought they were about to die, as if speaking her call sign into the dust might keep them alive. Mathis didn't recognize her. His eyes passed over her, a woman in civilian clothes, early 40s, tired, and found nothing familiar. Corey didn't look up at all. The intake clerk called her name with the same flat effect she used for everyone, Chen, Sarah. Sarah stood and walked toward the back office, and she heard Corey cough into his hand behind her. The sound of a man whose lungs had been damaged by smoke inhalation, who'd spent 6 weeks on a ventilator, whose breathing would never be easy again. She'd watched his chest rise and fall in that forward surgical tent, counting his respirations, willing them not to stop. Pain was data. Desperation was information. Fear was a tool if you knew how to hold it. The intake nurse was young, maybe 30, with the bureaucratic efficiency of someone processing hundreds of cases. "What brings you in today, Ms. Chen?" "Insomnia," Sarah said. "Service connected. I'd like to start treatment. Do you have military service documentation?" Sarah hesitated. This was the moment. She could produce nothing. No discharge papers. No DD 214 form. No records at all because Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen of Naval Special Warfare Group 4 had been classified, compartmentalized, and locked inside a black box marked Need to Know Only. Her Marjah operation had been officially buried. Her records had been erased. The military had given her a new social security number and a new identity as a civilian, which meant she'd simultaneously become a ghost to both worlds. "No," Sarah said. "I don't have documentation." The intake nurse nodded sympathetically. She'd heard this before, many times. "That makes it harder to prove service connection, but we can still help. Let me get you started on the intake forms." Sarah sat in an examination room filled with the static white hum of fluorescent lights and filled out paperwork about her sleep patterns, her nightmares, her hypervigilance, all carefully worded so that none of it explicitly referenced classified operations or units that didn't officially exist. The weight of the boots in the trash bag pressed against her leg. 12 years. That's how long it had been since she'd worn them. That's how long she'd been erased. Meanwhile, at Mercy General, Dr. Hargrove stood in the main lobby where news cameras were setting up for a segment about hospital safety protocols. He'd arranged this interview through his board connection. The journalist, a woman named Rebecca Walsh, had a reputation for focusing on sensational angles. He adjusted his white coat, positioned himself before the camera with the hospital logo visible over his left shoulder, and began explaining the necessity of strict hierarchical oversight and the dangers of staff members overstepping their license scope. Swift action is essential in healthcare leadership, Hargrove said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never questioned his own infallibility. When we discover that a staff member is operating beyond their training and credentials, we have an obligation to patients, to families, to the institution itself. Today we took decisive action. The camera was perfectly framed on his face when the first Black Hawk helicopter banked hard over the hospital, its rotor wash rattling the windows with such force that one of the camera operators turned instinctively toward the sound. Then the second bird appeared, both of them descending toward the parking lot in a synchronized approach pattern that belonged to military doctrine, not civilian aviation. Dr. Hargrove's words died in his throat. The color drained from his face with the kind of speed that happened when a person's entire constructed reality cracked open all at once. The rotor wash hit like a physical force, sheets of rain spraying sideways across the parking lot, and from the Black Hawks emerged 12 Navy SEALs in full tactical gear, weapons slung, moving with the fluid precision of men for whom violence was a technical skill. They disembarked in formation and marched toward the hospital entrance with the kind of purposeful stride that made security personnel step backward instinctively. The SEAL commander was a Master Chief with a chest full of ribbons, Bronze Star, Navy Commendation Medal, Joint Service Achievement Medal, and a presence that made the air pressure change the moment he stepped through the automatic doors. His jaw was set like stone. His eyes moved across the lobby with the assessment capacity of someone who'd cleared rooms in actual combat zones and now did it automatically, cataloging exits, distances, threats. He stopped directly in front of the news cameras, Dr. Hargrove frozen like a caught animal, and his voice cut through the hospital's ambient noise with the clarity of command. "We are looking for Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen, United States Navy Special Warfare." The journalist blinked. The cameras kept rolling. The assembled staff, nurses, doctors, administrators, fell completely silent. A Navy captain in dress whites emerged from the Black Hawk, her ribbons gleaming under the fluorescent lights of the hospital lobby, and she walked past the SEAL commander to stand beside the Master Chief. A rear admiral followed, 2 stars on each shoulder, the weight of authority that made the hospital CEO instinctively straighten her posture. The captain opened a folder and began reading, "Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen. Enlisted United States Navy 2006. Naval Special Warfare Group 4. Deployed to Afghanistan 2009 through 2019. Theater of Operations, Helm and Province. Call sign, Nightingale 6. She paused, letting the weight of each fact settle. Navy Cross for actions under fire in Marjah, 2011. The gathered crowd gasped. Hargrove's mouth had gone dry. The news cameras swung to capture his face, that moment of realization when a man understood he'd just destroyed his entire career on camera. The rear admiral spoke, his voice carrying to every corner of the lobby, 2 silver stars. Purple Heart with 3 clusters. Senior Chief Chen was attached to a forward surgical team that treated 214 combat wounded during a 7-day FOB overrun. She saved 47 lives, including General Wade. General Marcus Wade stepped into the lobby, pushing his own 4-pole, his hospital gown hanging off one shoulder, his surgical incision still bandaged. His voice was hoarse but clear, strengthened by the adrenaline surge from his cardiac event, from the knowledge that his memory had returned, from seeing the faces of the woman who'd carried him through fire. "She carried me 12 kilometers through sniper fire," Wade said, his words directed at the cameras, at the staff, at the world. "Through enemy territory. While bleeding. While under fire. I put her name on my arm so I would never forget." He held up his forearm, the tattoo stark and black, "Chen." The SEAL commander turned to Dr. Hargrove, whose face had cycled through purple and was now approaching white. "You're fired," the rear admiral said, his voice like judgment itself. Effective immediately. For compromising the cover of a decorated war hero on active reserve status. The hospital CEO was already nodding, already backing away. Yes, Admiral. Terminated. Yes. Immediately. The thunder of rotor blade silenced Mercy General at 03 for 7 hours. 2 UH-60M Black Hawks descended through the Norfolk fog like judgment itself, their landing lights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness, the wash-shaking windows on the 4th floor where night shift nurses froze mid-stride. The sound was unmistakable, military transport, operational precision, the kind of arrival that meant someone had signed off at the Pentagon level. The rotor wash died. Boots hit the pavement in synchronized formation. 12 Navy SEALs from DivGru, the finest operators in the Western Hemisphere, disembarked with the kind of controlled movement that came from 1,000 hours of coordinated violence. They didn't run. They walked. Their presence alone made the air feel heavier, the way apex predators change the pressure in a room just by breathing in it. The lead operator, call sign Breaker, carried a classified briefing folder under one arm. Behind him came a rear admiral in dress whites, his collar bearing the insignia of a man who'd shaped Special Operations Command across 3 continents. The security guard at Mercy General's main entrance didn't try to stop them. They moved through the lobby with the fluid precision of men accustomed to operating in denied spaces, men who'd cleared rooms in Kandahar and Mosul and places that didn't officially exist on any map. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed like angry insects, flickering against their uniforms. A nurse at the front desk reached for the phone. Breaker simply shook his head once. The phone went down. The lobby had perhaps 40 people at that hour, night shift skeleton crew, a few overnight family members in the waiting area, 2 security officers who suddenly understood they were observing something far above their pay grade. The silence that fell was the kind that comes right before lightning strikes, not quiet, but loaded, pregnant with consequences about to detonate. Breaker's voice carried to every corner of the atrium, controlled and precise, the kind of command voice that had directed men through crossfire. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen. Navy Special Warfare Medic. I need her now. Not in 5 minutes. Now. The words hung in the air like a live grenade with the pin pulled. Senior Chief. The rank alone meant elite, fewer than 800 people in the entire Navy held that designation. Special warfare. The euphemism for operators who existed in the spaces between policy and necessity. Medic. The one person in a combat team who could keep a shot soldier breathing when the helicopter was still 40 minutes out. A night supervisor approached, confused, her badge reading a Patricia Davis, RN. She'd worked at Mercy General for 19 years and had never seen her authority questioned in her own hospital. She opened her mouth. Breaker didn't give her the chance to speak. Senior Chief Chen. 3rd floor, West Corridor. We know exactly where she is. They took the stairs at speed. Sarah was reviewing discharge papers in the nurse station, her posture perfect, her hands steady as they'd been under mortar fire in Helmand Province, when the footsteps came. Heavy boots. Military gait. The unmistakable pattern of men operating in tactical formation. She didn't look up. Her training had taught her that when operators moved, you didn't make sudden movements. You waited for the contact. The contact always came. Breaker appeared in the corridor entrance, his frame filling the doorway, his eyes finding hers across 30 feet of linoleum and fluorescent light. Recognition flickered in his expression, confirmation of identity. The rear admiral stepped beside him. Behind them, 8 more operators positioned themselves in positions that casually controlled every exit and sight line in the corridor. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen, Breaker called, his voice carrying the weight of official documentation. Stand by for official notification of service recognition. The night shift nurses froze. One dropped a syringe. It clattered on the floor with a sound like a gunshot in the sudden silence. A physician's assistant moved backward instinctively, making space. Sarah set down her pen with precision and stood, her shoulders back, her posture shifting from nurse to something else entirely, something that had been waiting beneath the scrubs for 14 years. The rear admiral stepped forward, his dress whites catching the overhead light like a blade. His voice carried the authority of someone who'd never had to raise it, because everyone had always listened. In the presence of these witnesses, I am here to formally recognize the classified military service of Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen, United States Navy Special Warfare Command. Senior Chief, your record, deployed 5 times to combat theaters. Combat medic in direct action operations, Helmand Province and Marjah, Kandahar Province. Field surgical capability under fire. 47 personnel saved through emergency medical intervention in denied areas. Decorations, Navy Cross. He paused. The words landed like headstones. Silver Star. Another pause. Second Silver Star. The third pause was the longest. Purple Heart with 3 combat clusters. Your service has been classified at the highest levels and your identity has been protected under National Security Directive 23. That protection has been compromised by institutional negligence at this facility. News cameras were already outside the windows. Someone in hospital administration had tipped off the press the moment the Black Hawks landed. The Rear Admiral turned deliberately toward the glass, toward the camera lights beyond, his expression carved from stone. He raised his voice so every microphone outside could hear clearly. This hospital fired a decorated war hero without understanding who she was or what she'd sacrificed. A woman who carried a special forces general through enemy fire when he couldn't walk. A woman whose hands have performed field surgery under conditions you cannot imagine. A woman whose service is worth more than this entire institution's ability to compensate. A voice came from down the corridor, Dr. Hargrove, white coat flapping, face already pale with understanding. Now wait, I don't know what this is about, but if there's been some kind of mistake. The Rear Admiral turned slowly. The movement was like a shark changing direction. Dr. Marcus Hargrove. Chief of Medicine. I'm not asking you questions. I'm informing you of your termination effective immediately. You compromised the operational security cover of a decorated Special Forces medic on active reserve status. That's a federal crime. NCAS agents are currently executing a warrant on your office files and your home. Your medical license is under immediate review by the Virginia Board. Your career in medicine is over. Hospital security appeared in the corridor. The Rear Admiral simply pointed. Escort him from the building. Now. What happened next didn't silence the room. It ended it. The security officers, young men, both of them, both clearly conflicted, moved toward Hargrove. He backed away, his hands up, his mouth open, making sounds that weren't quite words. The Rear Admiral's aide was already on his phone, speaking quietly into a secure line. The SEALs formed up, a human corridor, and the security officers guided Hargrove toward the stairs like a man being led to something he'd finally understood he'd earned. Patricia Davis, the night supervisor, reached for Hargrove's arm. He jerked it away. His white coat caught on a supply cart. It tore. She let it fall. The last image anyone had of Dr. Marcus Hargrove at Mercy General was a man descending the stairwell while military operators watched, while cameras outside captured every second, while his life underwent structural failure in real time. The Rear Admiral turned back to Sarah. His eyes held something that might have been respect, might have been apology, might have been the recognition that some damage couldn't be undone. Senior Chief, Mercy General has requested your reinstatement with back pay and full pension contributions. The hospital has agreed to your choice of position. Any position. Anywhere in this facility. Sarah's voice came quiet, controlled, that steel-wrapped silk tone that had ordered men to move under fire. I'll need 2 things. The Rear Admiral waited. The entire corridor waited. The cameras outside waited. First, they remove every copy of that resignation pool whiteboard. Second, they donate $200,000 to the Naval Special Warfare Foundation. That's the price for me not walking to a lawyer's office today. The Rear Admiral almost smiled. Almost. He turned to a hospital administrator who'd appeared in the crowd, the CEO, looking like she'd aged 5 years in 4 minutes. You heard the Senior Chief. The CEO nodded so fast she nearly lost her balance. Yes. Absolutely. Whatever she needs. By sunrise, the whiteboard with Chen resignation pool was being photographed by news crews as a symbol of everything that went wrong when institutions confused obedience with competence. By noon, the first news cycle had already run the story nationally: Navy's elite rejected, hospital's arrogance exposed. By evening, Dr. Hargrove's private cell phone footage of him in a restaurant 2 weeks earlier, bragging to colleagues about firing a Maori nurse, had surfaced and gone viral, each clip a nail in a coffin he'd constructed himself. The Virginia Board of Nursing investigator, Collins, received a visit from 2 NCIS agents who explained with precise detail what federal charges applied to interfering with classified personnel. Collins withdrew his investigation before sunset. Patricia Hendricks, the board member who'd owed Hargrove favors, resigned the next morning when her son's DUI cover-up surfaced in follow-up reporting, media digging deeper, finding the threads that connected her to Hargrove's network, unraveling everything. 6 weeks later, no hospital in Virginia would credential Dr. Hargrove. 8 weeks later, he appeared at a strip mall on the outskirts of Norfolk, sitting at a folding table with a handwritten banner: supplemental insurance, affordable rates. A nurse from Mercy General spotted him there, unshaven, wearing a cheap polo shirt that didn't fit right, and took a photo. The photo circulated through the staff group chat with no caption. None was needed. Dr. Morris, who'd bet $500 that Sarah would quit within a week, requested an immediate transfer to a hospital in Ohio. He couldn't walk those hallways anymore, not after understanding what he'd mocked. The silence he encountered every time he entered the break room was its own kind of punishment, not anger, just absence. The recognition that he'd been wrong about someone, fundamentally and completely wrong in a way that couldn't be fixed with apology. 6 months later, Mercy General's main auditorium filled for a ceremony meant to repair damage that time alone wouldn't touch. Sarah stood on stage in dress white Navy uniform, the ribbons on her chest telling stories most people in that room couldn't read. General Marcus Wade, recovered and steady, carried a wooden box containing her promotion anchors, Master Chief Petty Officer, the highest enlisted rank in the Navy. His hand shook slightly as he pinned them to her collar. Then he did something no one expected. He lowered himself to one knee, his eyes clear for the first time since his stroke, his voice steady. "I never forgot your voice, I just needed to remember my own name first." The standing ovation lasted for minutes. In the back of the auditorium, veterans in wheelchairs held hand-lettered signs: "Nightingale 6, you saved me in Marjah." Sarah broke protocol, walked directly to them, embraced each one while cameras captured everything, while the world finally understood what had always been true: you do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. What did you think of Sarah's vindication? Did justice feel complete to you, or did Hargrove deserve worse? Subscribe for more stories about the quiet heroes walking among us, and leave a comment telling me, what would you have done in her position?